A husband left his pregnant wife right during labor on the road to go on vacation with his parents. But what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sun had set on a warm autumn evening when I first met Marcus. It was at a corporate gala, one of those extravagant events where everyone wore their best smiles, and conversations were sprinkled with ambition and champagne. I was there as a guest of my friend from work, a last-minute +1. Marcus stood out immediately, not just because of his tall frame and perfectly tailored suit, but because he carried himself with an ease that demanded attention without seeming forced. When he approached me, his smile was disarming, his charm undeniable. We talked for what felt like hours that night. He asked about my job at the small marketing firm, listened intently as I described the challenges of trying to break through in a competitive field, and laughed at my anecdotes as if I were the most interesting person in the room. It was refreshing, almost intoxicating to have someone of his stature, wealthy, powerful, confident, show such genuine interest in me. Or at least, it felt genuine at the time. The whirlwind romance that followed was nothing short of a fairy tale. Marcus was the epitome of the modern man, intelligent, successful, and seemingly progressive in his views. He often spoke about diversity and the importance of inclusion, something I found both rare and admirable in someone from his background. He was open about his wealth, but it never felt ostentatious. Instead, he seemed to value simplicity in his private life, or so he claimed. When he proposed just 6 months after we met, I was elated. The diamond ring sparkled like a promise, and the way he looked at me, full of pride and affection, made me believe that I had finally found someone who saw me for who I truly was. My family, though skeptical of the speed, supported my decision. My mother reminded me to trust my instincts, and my father, though reserved, gave his approval after a heartfelt talk with Marcus. The wedding was a spectacle, far beyond anything I could have imagined. Set in a grand estate with sprawling gardens, it was the kind of event you only see in movies. The guest list was a who's who of corporate elites, politicians, and influential figures, most of whom I had never met. My family, seated modestly in a corner, looked slightly out of place among the opulence, but they were happy for me, and that was all that mattered. However, there were small moments that pricked at the edges of my happiness. The way Marcus's mother, Eleanor, scrutinized me during the ceremony, her lips pursed in disapproval. The casual, almost dismissive tone his father, Richard, used when addressing my parents. And the way Marcus himself seemed to transform when surrounded by his family and peers, his warmth cooling into something more rigid, more formal. In the early days of our marriage, I tried to focus on the good. Marcus was busy, often working late or traveling for business, but he made an effort to call me every night, even if it was just for a few minutes. When he was home, he showered me with gifts, designer dresses, jewelry, and spontaneous dinner reservations at the city's most exclusive restaurants. Yet there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name, a subtle shift in the way he spoke to me, as if the pedestal he had once placed me on was no longer as steady. It was during one of these dinners that I had my first glimpse of his true nature. We were seated in a private room, enjoying a quiet evening after one of his long trips. The waiter, a young man, accidentally spilled water on the table. I expected Marcus to brush it off, but instead he snapped at the man with a sharpness that startled me. His tone was cold, his words cutting. When the waiter left, Marcus turned to me with a smile, as if nothing had happened. Some people just don't know how to do their jobs, he said casually. I laughed it off at the time, telling myself it was a one-time lapse, but the memory lingered. As the weeks turned into months, cracks began to show more clearly. Marcus's parents started visiting more often, and their disdain for me became harder to ignore. Eleanor would make backhanded comments about my appearance, subtly suggesting that I should dress more appropriately for someone in Marcus's position. Richard often addressed me as if I were an outsider, someone who needed to prove their worth to the family. Marcus, instead of defending me, seemed to align himself with them. "They just want the best for us," he would say, brushing off my concerns. "Don't take it personally." But it was personal. Every comment, every dismissive look chipped away at the image of the perfect marriage I had clung to. The turning point came during a dinner at their estate. Eleanor had prepared a lavish meal, and as we sat down, she began questioning me about my upbringing. Her tone was polite on the surface, but the underlying message was clear. I wasn't good enough. When I tried to steer the conversation away, Marcus joined in, almost mocking me. "She's sensitive," he said with a chuckle, addressing his parents. "It's just how she is." That night, I cried in the guest bedroom while Marcus slept soundly beside me. The man I'd married, the one who had promised to cherish and protect me, was nowhere to be found. Instead, I was left with someone who seemed more concerned with maintaining appearances than with my well-being. I began to notice other patterns. Marcus rarely introduced me to his colleagues or brought me to company events. When I asked why, he would dismiss it with vague excuses. "It's not the right crowd," or "you wouldn't enjoy it." I started to feel invisible, a mere accessory to his life rather than an equal partner. Despite everything, I held on to the hope that things would change, that the man I fell in love with would return. I told myself it was the stress of his job, the pressure from his parents. But deep down, I knew the truth. The man I thought I knew was a facade, and the reality was far more chilling. The weeks following our wedding stretched into months, and with each passing day the cracks in Marcus's carefully constructed persona grew wider. At first, it was subtle. Small dismissive comments, a lack of interest in my day-to-day life, but over time his indifference hardened into something more oppressive. I began to realize that the man I married was not the man I thought he was. The first major shift came when I found out I was pregnant. I was ecstatic, believing that this child could be the bridge to heal the growing rift between us. I imagined Marcus's joy at the news, how he would scoop me up in his arms and make promises of love and devotion for our growing family. Instead, his reaction was lukewarm. He barely looked up from his phone when I told him. "That's good, I guess," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But it doesn't mean you can start slacking off around here. You know how my parents are. They expect everything to be perfect." His words stung, but I smiled weakly and nodded, convincing myself that he was just overwhelmed. After all, he was under so much pressure at work, managing his massive company and keeping up appearances. Surely, once the reality of the baby sank in, he would change. But he didn't. As my pregnancy progressed, Marcus became increasingly demanding. He expected the house to remain spotless, the meals elaborate, and my demeanor cheerful, no matter how exhausted or nauseous I felt. Any attempt to rest was met with sharp remarks. "Pregnancy isn't a disability," he would say, rolling his eyes. "Stop using it as an excuse." His parents, Eleanor and Richard, began visiting more frequently, each visit feeling like an interrogation. Eleanor would critique everything, from the way I set the table to the way I carried myself. "A wife of Marcus's stature should have more poise," she said one evening, her tone dripping with condescension. Richard was no better. He often ignored me entirely, addressing Marcus as if I weren't in the room. When he did speak to me, his words were curt, tinged with disdain. "Marcus could have married anyone," he once said. "You should feel grateful." Grateful. That word became a noose around my neck, tightening with every passing day. Grateful for what? For being treated like an outsider in my own home? For being reduced to a vessel carrying their grandchild, a mere accessory to Marcus's life? The isolation was suffocating. Marcus discouraged me from seeing my friends, claiming they were a bad influence. When I pushed back, he accused me of being ungrateful for the life he provided. "Do you know how lucky you are to be married to me?" he would say, his voice cold and clipped. "Other women would kill to be in your position." I started to believe him. Maybe I was ungrateful. Maybe I was expecting too much. After all, he worked tirelessly to maintain his company and provide for us. Who was I to complain? But even as I tried to rationalize his behavior, a seed of resentment took root in my heart. The turning point came during one of Eleanor and Richard's weekend visits. I had spent the entire day cleaning the house, preparing a lavish dinner, and trying to keep my swelling feet from giving out. By the time they arrived, I was exhausted but determined to make a good impression. Eleanor swept into the house like a queen inspecting her court. She glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning for imperfections. "The flowers on the table are wilting," she said, wrinkling her nose, "and the roast is overcooked. Really, Marcus, I don't know how you tolerate this." Marcus didn't defend me. Instead, he nodded in agreement. "She's still learning," he said, as if I weren't standing right there. I clenched my fists under the table, biting back tears. This was my home, my life, and yet I felt like a guest, unwelcome and unworthy. That night, after they left, I confronted Marcus. "Why didn't you stand up for me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me with irritation as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "Because they're right," he said. "You need to do better. This isn't some shabby apartment you're used to. This is our home, and it needs to reflect our status." I slept in the guest room that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I had ended up here. The man I once loved was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as little more than a servant. My pregnancy, which should have been a time of joy and connection, was turning into a nightmare. As the months wore on, Marcus's behavior grew more controlling. He began monitoring my spending, questioning every purchase I made. "Why do you need another dress?" he asked one day, holding up the receipt. "You're already outgrowing the ones you have." Eleanor and Richard's visits became more frequent, their critiques more cutting. They treated my pregnancy as an inconvenience, something that would temporarily disrupt their lives before returning to normal. Eleanor even suggested hiring a nanny immediately after the baby was born, so I could focus on keeping the house in order. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I collapsed on the couch, my body aching. Marcus walked in and frowned. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Resting," I said weakly. "It's been a long day." He scoffed. "Resting? You've been home all day. Do you think I get to rest after working 12-hour days to provide for you?" I wanted to scream, to tell him that growing a human being inside me was work, that I was exhausted beyond belief. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Marcus didn't care about my struggles. To him, I was an extension of his image, a piece of his carefully curated life. I began to withdraw, retreating into myself to survive. My world shrank to the walls of our house, my days consumed by cleaning, cooking, and enduring the constant stream of criticism from Marcus and his parents. The man I thought I loved had become a stranger, and I was starting to realize that the fairy tale I had believed in was nothing more than a lie. The announcement of the family trip came out of nowhere. Marcus was seated at the head of the dining table, scrolling through his phone as I served dinner. I was 7 months pregnant, my belly prominent and my feet perpetually swollen. Balancing the heavy pot of stew in my hands, I moved carefully to avoid spilling anything on the pristine tablecloth Eleanor had gifted us, a proper accessory for a wife of Marcus's caliber, as she had called it. "We're going to the mountains next weekend," Marcus said, not looking up from his phone. I froze mid-step. "Next weekend," I echoed. "I thought you were swamped with work." "It's a family trip," he replied curtly, as if that explained everything. A family trip. Which, of course, meant his parents would be coming along. The idea of being confined with Eleanor and Richard for an entire weekend filled me with dread. They had become increasingly unbearable over the past months, treating me like a live-in maid rather than their son's wife. And Marcus, he no longer even pretended to stand up for me. He had embraced their critiques, their expectations, their disdain. "I don't think I can," I said hesitantly, setting the pot down on the table. "I'm 7 months pregnant, Marcus. Traveling isn't safe right now." He finally looked up, his expression a mixture of irritation and disbelief. "You're not sick," he said, his tone sharp. "Pregnancy isn't a disability. Besides, my parents have been planning this for weeks. It would be disrespectful to cancel now." His words stung, as they always did, but I swallowed my protest. I had learned by now that arguing with Marcus only made things worse. When his mind was set, there was no changing it. And so, a week later, I found myself in the back seat of Marcus's luxury SUV, Eleanor and Richard seated up front, chatting animatedly about their plans for the trip. The drive was unbearable. Eleanor spent most of it critiquing my appearance, pointing out how much weight I'd gained during the pregnancy. Richard chimed in occasionally, making sarcastic comments about my pregnancy glow and how it didn't quite meet his expectations. Marcus, of course, said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set, as if he were determined to ignore the tension in the car. When we finally arrived at the rented chalet, I was exhausted. My feet ached from the long drive and my back was screaming in protest. But there was no time to rest. Eleanor immediately began assigning me tasks, unpacking the suitcases, preparing lunch, making sure the rooms were to her liking. Marcus offered no assistance, busying himself with his parents' demands and leaving me to manage everything on my own. It was during lunch that the first pangs of discomfort began. At first, I dismissed them as nothing more than the usual aches and pains of pregnancy, but as the afternoon wore on, the discomfort grew into sharp, rhythmic contractions. I tried to hide my distress, not wanting to draw attention to myself, but by dinner it was impossible to ignore. I clutched my belly, wincing as another contraction rippled through me. "What's wrong with you now?" Marcus asked, his tone impatient. "I think I'm in labor," I said, my voice trembling. Eleanor scoffed. "Nonsense, it's far too early. You're just being dramatic." "I'm serious," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "We need to go to the hospital." Marcus sighed heavily, as if my pain were a personal inconvenience. "You can't just wait it out. We're in the middle of dinner." "Wait it out?" I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "Marcus, this isn't something I can just—" Before I could finish, another contraction seized me, cutting off my words. I doubled over in pain, clutching the edge of the table for support. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Fine," he snapped. "Let's go." Relief flooded through me as he grabbed his car keys, but it was short-lived. As we stepped outside, he paused, his expression darkening. "You're not getting in the car like that," he said, gesturing to my soaked dress. My heart sank. "Marcus, I don't have time to change. My water broke." "Exactly," he said coldly. "You'll ruin the upholstery." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you serious right now?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back toward the house, calling over his shoulder, "Figure it out. I'm not dealing with this right now." And just like that, he was gone. The man I had once trusted with my life had abandoned me in my most vulnerable moment. Tears streamed down my face as I stood there, clutching my belly and gasping for breath. The contractions were coming faster now, each one more intense than the last. I needed help, but there was no one to turn to, or so I thought. "Lisa?" The voice was soft but urgent, cutting through the fog of my pain. I turned to see Sarah, my neighbor, rushing toward me. Her face was etched with concern as she took in my disheveled state. "I think I'm in labor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Without hesitation, Sarah wrapped an arm around my shoulders, guiding me to her car. "Don't worry," she said firmly. "I'll get you to the hospital." The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and panic, but Sarah's presence was a lifeline. She held my hand, whispered words of encouragement, and assured me that everything would be okay. By the time we arrived, I was barely conscious, the pain overwhelming my senses. As the nurses wheeled me into the delivery room, I caught a glimpse of Sarah speaking to the hospital staff, her voice calm and authoritative. In that moment, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tenuous thing, but hope nonetheless. I wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in months, I felt like someone truly cared. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. The hours at the hospital were a chaotic blur, filled with frantic voices, bright fluorescent lights, and the relentless waves of pain that tore through my body. Nurses bustled around me, their faces calm and reassuring as they worked to stabilize me. Sarah, my neighbor and unexpected savior, stayed by my side, holding my hand and whispering encouragement. "Breathe, Lisa. You've got this," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Her presence grounded me. In the absence of Marcus, who had abandoned me at the most critical moment of my life, Sarah became my anchor. She managed everything with a calm efficiency, speaking to the doctors, contacting my parents, and making sure I wasn't alone. As I was wheeled into the delivery room, my thoughts swirled between fear and determination. This child, I reminded myself, was the one good thing to come out of the nightmare that had become my marriage. I clung to that thought as labor intensified, each contraction racking my body with an intensity I hadn't imagined possible. After what felt like an eternity, the room was filled with the piercing cry of my baby. Tears streamed down my face as the nurse placed a tiny, swaddled form in my arms. My child. My beautiful, perfect child. For the first time in months, I felt an overwhelming surge of love and purpose. It didn't matter that Marcus wasn't here. It didn't matter that his parents would probably never accept this baby as a part of their family. This child was mine, and I would do everything in my power to give them a better life. My parents arrived soon after, their faces etched with worry but softening with relief when they saw me holding the baby. My mother leaned down to kiss my forehead, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're so strong," she whispered. My father, usually stoic, was visibly emotional as he stroked the baby's tiny hand. "We'll take care of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not alone in this." Sarah stayed long enough to ensure I was settled before quietly excusing herself. "If you need anything, call me," she said. "I'll check in tomorrow." Before she left, she gave my parents a meaningful look, and they nodded in silent understanding. It was clear that she had told them everything about what had happened with Marcus. Part of me felt ashamed that they now knew the full extent of my suffering, but another part was relieved. The burden of hiding the truth was gone. The next morning, as I cradled my newborn, I received a flood of missed calls and messages from Marcus. Each one was more frantic than the last. "Lisa, where are you? I heard you went into labor. Why didn't you call me? This is unacceptable. I'm your husband, and I deserve to know what's going on. You're making me look bad. Call me back immediately." I stared at the phone, my emotions a tangle of anger and disbelief. Marcus's concern wasn't for me or the baby. It was for his reputation. I turned off the phone without responding, knowing that engaging with him would only bring more pain. By midday, Sarah returned, this time with a fruit basket and a warm smile. She looked genuinely relieved to see me in better spirits. We talked quietly while my parents cooed over the baby in the corner of the room. Then, Sarah dropped a revelation that left me stunned. "My husband," she began, choosing her words carefully, "is the CEO of the company where Marcus works. I told him what happened." The weight of her words hit me like a freight train. Sarah's husband wasn't just anyone. He was the man who held Marcus's career in his hands. I felt a mix of dread and vindication as she continued. "He's furious," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Not just about what Marcus did to you, but about the kind of person he's been all along. This isn't the first time he's heard troubling things about Marcus, but this crossed every line." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell her to leave it alone, to avoid causing more chaos. But another part, a darker and angrier part, felt a surge of satisfaction. Marcus had built his life on power, control, and appearances. He had used me as a prop in his carefully curated image, and now that image was cracking. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital and moved in with my parents. They had prepared a room for me and the baby, decorating it with soft colors and small, thoughtful touches. It wasn't the mansion I had shared with Marcus, but it felt more like home than that cold, sterile house ever had. Sarah visited often, bringing homemade meals and helping me navigate the overwhelming new world of motherhood. Her kindness was a balm to my bruised spirit, but it was her next visit that brought the most unexpected news. "My husband confronted Marcus," she said, sitting beside me as the baby slept peacefully in the crib. "He's been fired." I blinked, trying to process her words. "Fired?" I echoed. Sarah nodded. "Marcus's behavior was unacceptable, both personally and professionally. My husband believes that a man who can't respect his own family can't be trusted to lead a company." For the first time in months, I felt the weight of Marcus's control lift from my shoulders. He had used his power to belittle and manipulate me, but now that power was gone. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild my life. Sarah's husband offered me a position at his company, a flexible role that allowed me to work from home and care for my baby. It wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline, a way to regain my independence and provide for my child. Meanwhile, Marcus's life unraveled. News of his behavior spread quickly, tarnishing his reputation among his peers. His parents, who had always prided themselves on their social standing, became pariahs in their community. They tried to contact me, pleading for understanding, but I refused to engage. They had shown me nothing but cruelty, and I owed them nothing in return. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope. My life wasn't perfect. It was messy and uncertain, filled with late-night feedings and financial worries, but it was mine. And that, I realized, was enough. Life at my parents' house felt like stepping into a sanctuary I hadn't realized I needed. The walls, painted in soft pastels, radiated warmth, and the scent of my mother's cooking filled the air. My father often sat by the crib, humming lullabies to my baby, his usually stern face softened by the presence of his grandchild. For the first time in months, I felt safe. But safety didn't mean forgetting. The scars Marcus had left, emotional, mental, even physical, in the form of lingering exhaustion from stress, were still fresh. Though I avoided reading his messages and ignored his calls, a part of me was bracing for whatever chaos would inevitably follow. And chaos did follow, but not in the way I had expected. A week after my discharge from the hospital, Sarah visited again, her face a mix of concern and determination. She had barely set down the casserole dish she brought when she leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "It's worse than I thought," she said. I tensed, clutching my baby a little tighter. "What do you mean?" "My husband's decision to fire Marcus wasn't the end of it," she explained. "Word spread quickly about why he was let go, and his reputation has taken a massive hit. Some of his peers in the industry are distancing themselves from him. And then there's the video." "The video?" I asked, confused. Sarah hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed me a social media post. It was a short clip, blurry but unmistakable. It showed me standing on the side of the road, clutching my belly, while Marcus stormed back to the house. The caption read, "CEO abandons pregnant wife during labor." The post had gone viral, with thousands of comments condemning Marcus. People were outraged by his cruelty, and many had gone out of their way to share the post, tagging Marcus's former colleagues and associates. As I scrolled through the comments, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. On one hand, I was humiliated that such a personal, painful moment had been made public. On the other, I felt a grim sense of justice. Marcus had built his life on appearances, and now those same appearances were crumbling. Who posted this?" I asked. Sarah shook her head. "A bystander, I think. Someone who happened to see what happened and wanted to call out the injustice. They blurred your face to protect your privacy." I nodded slowly, my mind spinning. It felt surreal, watching the world react to something so deeply personal. But it also felt like vindication. Marcus had always cared more about his image than anything else, and now that image was irreparably tarnished. Over the next few days, the fallout from the video continued to grow. Sarah kept me updated, sharing snippets of conversations she overheard or updates from her husband. Marcus had tried to reach out to several of his former contacts, hoping to salvage his reputation, but no one wanted to be associated with him. His parents, Eleanor and Richard, weren't spared either. The community that once admired their wealth and influence now viewed them with disdain. Rumors circulated about their role in enabling Marcus's behavior, and invitations to social events began to dry up. One morning, as I was feeding the baby, my phone buzzed incessantly. I picked it up reluctantly, only to see a string of missed calls from Eleanor. Against my better judgment, I listened to one of the voicemails. "Lisa, this is Eleanor. We need to talk. Whatever issues you have with Marcus, they shouldn't affect the family. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. Call me back immediately." I deleted the message without responding. Eleanor's words were laced with the same arrogance and entitlement that had defined her treatment of me from the beginning. She didn't care about me or the baby, only about protecting the fragile reputation of her family. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me any further. Later that week, my father answered the house phone, his face darkening as he listened to the caller. When he hung up, he turned to me, his jaw clenched. "That was Richard," he said. "He thinks you should drop all this and come back to Marcus. He called it a family matter and said you were being unreasonable." I sighed, exhaustion washing over me. "And what did you say?" "I told him that my daughter is no longer his concern and hung up." My father's voice was firm, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of relief. I wasn't fighting this battle alone. As Marcus's world continued to crumble, my own began to slowly rebuild. Sarah's husband officially offered me a position in his company, a remote role that allowed me to balance work and motherhood. It was more than a job. It was a lifeline, a way to regain my independence. I threw myself into my work, determined to prove that I could thrive without Marcus. Meanwhile, Marcus's attempts to contact me became more desperate. He sent long, rambling emails filled with apologies and excuses. "I was under so much pressure," one read. "I didn't know how to handle it. Please give me another chance." But I knew better. His apologies weren't born out of genuine remorse. They were a reaction to his crumbling life. He didn't want me back because he loved me. He wanted me back because he needed to repair his image. One day, he showed up unannounced at my parents' house. My father met him at the door, his expression cold and unyielding. "You're not welcome here," my father said firmly. Marcus tried to argue, his voice pleading. "I just want to see my wife and child." "She's not your wife anymore," my father replied, "and you made it clear what your priorities were when you left her on the side of the road." Marcus left that day with nothing but his humiliation. I watched from the window, holding my baby close, and felt a sense of closure. He had lost the power to control me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. Settling into life at my parents' house felt like stepping into an entirely new world, one that was quieter, more supportive, and filled with the kind of love I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Every corner of their modest home radiated warmth, from the sun-dappled kitchen where my mother prepared hearty meals to the nursery my father had lovingly set up for the baby. It wasn't extravagant, but it was home, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. The mornings started early, with the soft cries of my newborn pulling me from sleep. Despite the sleepless nights, I found joy in every small milestone, every yawn, every gurgle, every tiny smile. My parents were a constant presence, stepping in to help when I needed a break or simply to dote on their grandchild. Their support gave me the space to begin healing, physically and emotionally. Work became a lifeline for me. Sarah's husband had been true to his word, offering me a flexible position in his company. It was a role that combined writing and research, tasks I could manage from home while caring for my baby. At first, I was nervous, worried that I wouldn't be able to balance everything, or that my skills had dulled during the chaos of my marriage. But as I immersed myself in the work, I found a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The first project I completed, a report on market trends, earned praise from Sarah's husband during a video call. "Excellent work, Lisa," he said, his tone warm and encouraging. You've got a sharp mind. I'm glad we brought you on board." Those words meant more to me than I could express. For so long, I had been made to feel small, incapable, as though my worth was tied solely to my role as Marcus's wife. Now, I was proven to myself, and to everyone else, that I was so much more than that. While I was busy rebuilding my life, Marcus's continued to unravel. Sarah kept me updated on the fallout from his dismissal. He had struggled to find another job, his reputation in the corporate world irreparably damaged by the viral video and the whispers that followed. His parents, once revered in their social circle, had become outcasts, their wealth and influence no longer enough to shield them from judgment. Marcus himself had reached a breaking point. One evening, Sarah shared that he had tried to reach out to her husband, begging for a second chance. "He's desperate," she said, her tone laced with disdain. "But my husband isn't entertaining it. He told Marcus that actions have consequences, and that he's no longer welcome in his company." Hearing this, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was glad that Marcus was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Another part felt a lingering sadness, not for him, but for the life I had once imagined we could build together. That dream was gone, and I had made peace with that. But the scars it left behind were still tender. As the weeks turned into months, my confidence grew. My work flourished, my baby thrived, and I began to find joy in the small, everyday moments. Watching my child discover the world, a world free from the toxicity of my marriage, filled me with a sense of hope. I vowed to create a life for us built on love, respect, and resilience. One day, Sarah visited with a large bag of baby clothes and toys. "These are from my son," she said, smiling as she handed me the bag. "He's outgrown them, but they're still in great shape." Her generosity brought tears to my eyes. "You've done so much for me already," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Sarah placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to repay me," she said gently. "Just focus on building the life you deserve." Her words stayed with me. I'd spent so long living in Marcus's shadow, bending to his will and trying to meet his impossible standards. Now I was free to define my own path, to be the kind of mother and person I wanted to be. One evening, as I rocked my baby to sleep, I caught my reflection in the nursery window. The woman staring back at me was different from the one who had stood on the side of the road, abandoned and broken. This woman was stronger, more determined. She had faced the worst and come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. Later that night, as I sat at my desk finishing up a work project, I received an unexpected email from Marcus. The subject line read simply, "Please." Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email was long, filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. He claimed to have changed, to have realized the error of his ways. He begged me to give him another chance, to let him be part of our child's life. I stared at the screen, my emotions swirling. A part of me wanted to believe him, to hope that he had truly changed, but the deeper, wiser part of me knew better. Marcus's words were empty, driven by desperation rather than genuine remorse. He hadn't reached out because he loved me or the baby. He had reached out because he wanted to rebuild his shattered life. I closed the email without replying. Marcus had made his choices, and now I was making mine. My life was no longer tied to his. It was mine to shape, and I was determined to make it a life worth living, not just for me, but for my child. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my baby's laughter. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting the room in soft, golden hues. I scooped up my child, holding them close as they giggled and reached for my face. In that moment, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. This was my new life, a life filled with challenges, yes, but also with love, hope, and endless possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The morning was bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Marcus's life. I didn't need updates from Sarah or her husband to know things weren't going well for him. The silence from his side was deafening, a sure sign that his once carefully curated world was falling apart. Yet, even in the quiet, the echoes of his desperation reached me. It started with the documents. The divorce papers I'd sent through my lawyer were straightforward. A clean break with no unnecessary entanglements. I'd waived claims to his wealth, knowing that I wanted nothing from him except freedom. What I hadn't anticipated was his refusal to sign. "This is ridiculous," Marcus had barked during a phone call facilitated by our lawyers. His voice, once commanding, now trembled with anger and fear. "We can work this out. There's no need for a divorce." But there was every need. His betrayal was etched into my memory like a scar, and no amount of pleading or promises could erase it. As the legal battle dragged on, Marcus's situation grew increasingly dire. Sarah's updates painted a grim picture. His reputation in the corporate world was irreparable. Potential employers were unwilling to take a chance on someone whose name had become synonymous with scandal. Even his parents, Eleanor and Richard, were beginning to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. Their social circle had abandoned them, unwilling to be associated with the disgrace that now followed their family. Eleanor, who had once delighted in hosting extravagant dinner parties, was now a virtual recluse. Richard, whose booming voice had once commanded respect, now avoided public spaces altogether. Marcus's attempts to salvage his image became more desperate with each passing week. He tried issuing public statements, crafting carefully worded apologies that were met with widespread skepticism. The Internet, ruthless in its judgment, refused to forget. One day, I received a call from my lawyer. He sounded both amused and exasperated. "Marcus is trying to contest the divorce," he said. "He claims he still loves you and that the baby needs a father." I laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it. Marcus's sudden interest in our child wasn't born of paternal love. It was a last-ditch effort to cling to something, anything, that could restore a semblance of control over his life. "Do we have to entertain this?" I asked, cradling my baby in one arm while balancing the phone with the other. "No," my lawyer assured me. "We'll push forward. He has no grounds to contest, and the court won't look favorably on his behavior." I nodded, feeling a flicker of relief. The end of this chapter was drawing closer, and with it, the final severance of the ties that had bound me to Marcus. Marcus's desperation hit its peak when he showed up uninvited at Sarah's home. According to Sarah, he was disheveled, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by a disconcerting disarray. He demanded to see her husband, hoping to appeal to him for a second chance. Sarah's husband, ever composed, reportedly listened patiently before delivering a decisive blow. "I trusted you once," he said, his voice measured but firm. "You betrayed that trust, not just with your actions against your wife, but in the way you've conducted yourself in this company and beyond. There's no place for someone like you here." When Sarah recounted the encounter to me later, her expression was a mix of satisfaction and pity. "He left with his head down," she said. "I think he finally realized just how far he's fallen." The final straw came when the court ruled in my favor. The divorce was granted, and Marcus was ordered to pay child support, a decision he tried to fight but ultimately couldn't overturn. The property division was minimal, as I had no interest in his wealth or assets, but the symbolic victory was enough. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. The repercussions for Marcus didn't end there. News of his financial struggles began circulating among former colleagues and acquaintances. He had over-leveraged himself, relying on his inflated income to sustain a lavish lifestyle. Without a job or the connections he once wielded, he struggled to keep up with mortgage payments and other expenses. Reports trickled in through Sarah's network. Marcus had moved back in with his parents, the mansion he once flaunted repossessed by the bank. Eleanor and Richard, already reeling from their social exile, were now burdened with their son's collapse. In the midst of all this, I found myself reflecting on the life I had left behind. It wasn't satisfaction I felt at Marcus's downfall, it was closure. He had built his life on a foundation of arrogance and cruelty, and now that foundation had crumbled. I no longer carried the weight of his judgment or the pain of his betrayal. Instead, my life was filled with new beginnings. My baby, who had become the center of my world, reminded me every day of my resilience. My work flourished, giving me a sense of independence and purpose I hadn't felt in years. And my parents, whose unwavering support had carried me through my darkest moments, continued to be my greatest source of strength. One evening, as I rocked my baby to sleep, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Marcus. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to open it. Curiosity won out, and I clicked. The email was long, filled with apologies and regret. Marcus admitted to his faults, acknowledging the pain he had caused me. He claimed he wanted to change, to be a better man and father. I read the email carefully, my emotions calm and steady. When I reached the end, I closed it without replying. Marcus's journey was no longer my concern. My focus was on my future, my child, and the life I was building, one that was free from his shadow. As I stood by the crib, watching my baby's peaceful slumber, I felt a profound sense of peace. Marcus's downfall was his own doing, a result of choices he had made. My life, on the other hand, was moving forward, filled with hope and endless possibilities. Life began to settle into a rhythm that was uniquely mine. Days started early with the cries of my baby, their small hands reaching out as if to grasp the world they were just beginning to explore. Each moment spent with them was a reminder of the resilience that had carried me through the darkest chapter of my life. My world, once overshadowed by Marcus and his family's cruelty, was now filled with warmth, love, and promise. At my parents' house, every corner of the home became a haven of support. My father, who had always been a quiet and steady presence, seemed to transform into a doting grandfather. He spent hours reading aloud from picture books, his deep voice soothing as he cradled my baby. My mother, her hands always busy with some task, would sneak into the nursery just to watch the baby sleep, her eyes soft with love. Work gave me a new sense of purpose. The position Sarah's husband had offered me was more than just a job. It was a chance to reclaim my independence. I threw myself into projects, finding fulfillment in tasks that challenged me and allowed me to grow. The flexibility of working remotely allowed me to balance my professional ambitions with the demands of motherhood, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was thriving. Sarah continued to be a constant presence in my life, stopping by with meals or offering to babysit when I needed a break. Her friendship had become a cornerstone of my recovery, a reminder that kindness and community could exist even in the face of cruelty. One evening, she and her husband invited me and my parents over for dinner. It was a simple affair, held in their cozy home, but it felt monumental. Sitting around their dining table, sharing laughter and stories, I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't experienced in years. During the meal, Sarah's husband turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You've been doing incredible work," he said. "I've been impressed by your dedication and creativity. Have you thought about expanding your role within the company?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Expanding?" I asked. He nodded. "I see potential in you, Lisa. I think you're ready for more responsibility, if you're interested." The offer filled me with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Taking on a larger role would be a significant step, one that would challenge me in ways I hadn't anticipated. But as I looked at my baby, sleeping peacefully in the portable crib Sarah had set up, I felt a surge of determination. I wanted to show myself, that I was capable of more. "I'd love to," I said, my voice steady. "Thank you for believing in me." Meanwhile, Marcus's attempts to regain control of his life continued to falter. Through Sarah, I learned that his financial troubles had worsened. Without steady employment, or the connections he once relied on, he was struggling to stay afloat. The mansion he had so proudly flaunted was gone, replaced by a modest apartment he shared with his parents. Rumors of his downfall circulated among the people who had once admired him. His name, once synonymous with success, had become a cautionary tale. Even his parents, Eleanor and Richard, had retreated from public life, their pride shattered by the scandal that had enveloped their family. I felt no satisfaction in their misery, only a quiet sense of closure. They had built their lives on a foundation of arrogance and prejudice, and now they were facing the consequences of their actions. My focus was no longer on them, but on the future I was building for myself and my child. As the months passed, I began to see the world through a new lens. My baby's laughter became the soundtrack to my days, their joy infectious and unrelenting. Every milestone they reached, rolling over, their first smile, their first hesitant steps, felt like a triumph, not just for them, but for me as well. I was creating a life for them filled with love and stability, a life free from the shadows of the past. One afternoon, as I sat in the park watching my child toddle across the grass, I reflected on how far I had come. The woman who had stood on the side of the road, abandoned and broken, felt like a distant memory. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had faced the worst and come out the other side with a renewed sense of purpose. It was during one of these quiet moments that I decided to put pen to paper. I began writing about my experiences, not just the pain and betrayal, but also the resilience and growth that had followed. The words flowed easily, a cathartic release that allowed me to process everything I had endured. Over time, those writings evolved into something more, a story of hope, a testament to the strength that can be found in the face of adversity. I shared my story online, unsure of what to expect. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from women who had faced similar struggles, their words filled with gratitude and solidarity. They thanked me for sharing my journey, for giving them hope that they, too, could find their way out of the darkness. The support I received from strangers around the world was a powerful reminder that I wasn't alone. My story had become a beacon for others, a way to shine a light on the issues of abuse and inequality that so many faced in silence. One evening, as I tucked my child into bed, I whispered a promise to them. "You'll grow up knowing love," I said softly. "You'll know respect and kindness, and you'll never doubt your worth. That promise became my guiding star. I was determined to raise my child in a world that was better than the one I had escaped. And as I looked at their peaceful face, I felt a surge of hope, a belief that the future could be brighter, not just for us, but for everyone willing to fight for a better life. The past no longer held power over me. My life was mine to shape, and I was ready to embrace every possibility it had to offer. With my child in my arms and hope in my heart, I stepped forward into a future filled with love, resilience, and endless promise. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and check out our other videos for even more inspiring content. If you enjoyed this, share it with friends to keep the conversation going.